What happened to Spy Family? It's still one of the most popular series and the manga is always in the top 10, but nobody really talks about it anymore. Obviously, it's been a while since the last season, but the reality is that the anime suffered from its success. And with it becoming insanely popular, a lot of longtime fans got tired of hearing about it. Now with season 3 coming soon and the manga running for over 6 years, you're probably wondering if Spy Family is still any good. Well, as someone that started the manga back in 2019 and just caught back up to the newest chapters, I can confidently say that Spy Family is better than ever. It stays true to the wholesome charm that made it popular to begin with, and brilliantly solved its biggest flaw. But some of you might be wondering whether the wholesome part of the story is overhyped. Because even today you can find reviews where people say Spy Family sells you on a spy thriller, but bores you with a slice of life story where nothing ever happens. So if you're a new fan, there is a legitimate question of whether Spy Family is just another anime that doesn't have an interesting plot. But as many people will agree, this slice of life aspect is what makes the story so great, and it's because it leads to some amazing character moments. This is something that was very clear even when the manga was still a niche series. The first time I heard about Spy Family, it was all the way back in 2019 when I was mostly reading stuff like Black Clover and My Hero. The manga was around 20 chapters at this point, and people kept pushing it and saying it was criminally underrated. People were reading it, but it was only just entering the mainstream, and nobody really knew if it would get an anime soon. But because these fans praised it for its wholesome story, I naturally decided to check it out as a break from the usual shonen battle series. And that is exactly how it should be read. The story has plenty of action, but the best thing about it is that its small family always finds their happy ending. If you're unfamiliar with the story, Spy Family is set in a fictional version of the Cold War in Europe and follows the story of Lloyd, Yor, and Anya. Lloyd is a spy that's given the mission to spy on a politician that might start a new war. To do that, he adopts Anya and enrolls her in the same school as the politician's son. Anya is an orphan who has psychic abilities, but would rather watch spy movies than read people's minds. Unfortunately, the school requires that they meet the father and mother of the child for enrollment, so Lloyd struggles to find a woman he can fraudulently marry until he meets Yor. Yor is an assassin who works at the government as a cover. When all the girls say she's weird for not being married yet, Yor worries that her cover might get blown and she'll be reported to the police. So when she meets Lloyd and hears his bizarre request, it weirdly works in her favor. Which is how we get our main family of Lloyd the spy, Anya the esper, and Yor the assassin. And besides the fact that this mix of characters makes for some hilarious hijinks, it also makes for a ton of wholesome moments. Anya is bored at school and is always looking for adventure. Lloyd has to watch over her but cherishes his new job as it's the only real family he's had after the war. And Yor feels like a real mother while she protects Anya and learns all the normal skills she never learned as an assassin, like cooking and cleaning. The brilliant part is that these characters are pretty weird, but they're perfectly relatable. Series creator Tatsuya Endo uses the Cold War setting as a way to reference the family dynamics of hiding parts of ourselves while still trying to be honest and vulnerable, and it leads to a lot of moments where the characters find out how to be part of a family despite their insecurities. It's not unreasonable to say Spy Family plays out a lot like Full House. The characters are all pretty weird and they get into absurd incidents, but at the end of every chapter, they always manage to find the best outcome and grow together as a family, even if it's not a normal family. As you can imagine, it didn't take long for Spy Family to use that wholesome charm to become a mainstream success. Spy Family already had 1 million volumes in circulation by volume 2, and by volume 8 it had reached 8 million. Naturally, it didn't take long for the series to get its own anime, and when it finally dropped, the series became an overnight success. Season 1 dropped in spring of 2022. At the time, its only competition was Shield Hero Season 2, Kaguya-sama Season 2, and Komi-san. Komi-san was still on Netflix, so it wasn't quite as trendy. Kaguya-sama was as popular as ever, but it was a second season, whereas Spy Family was a brand new series. And Shield Hero has its fans, but it hasn't really been a big series for a while. Actually, I see people bring it up, but it's just one of those shows that just isn't that popular. Naturally, you can see how Spy Family came to dominate the spring season. It became so popular that people were dropping memes right away. Even today, the series has an 8.5 overall depending on which sites you visit. In fact, on LiveChart, it's still in the top 50 rated anime, which is pretty insane considering it only had one season. Well, technically it has 2 seasons, but we'll get to that in just a second. Before that, I should mention that Spy Family was so popular that it even got its own movie. That's right, after just one season, Spy Family got its very own movie, something that only the most popular series ever see. At this point, Spy Family was breaking all kinds of records. Following season 1, the manga reached 31 million copies in circulation. Today it has at least 38 million copies. You might say that it slowed down, but keep in mind, there's 2 things going on. One, Spy Family is more or less on a semi-weekly schedule, so every other week. On top of that, the anime was split into parts. Well, sort of. Which brings us back to what I said before. So season 1 came out in spring 2022. Then they did the new thing where they split it up into 2 parts, dropping the next core in the fall of 22. Now at the time, this was not a brand new idea. Attack on Titan had done it, Stone Ocean had done it, and they would even do it to Bleach. But this was still relatively new, and people weren't used to the idea of splitting the cores apart by 6 months. They actually hated it for Attack on Titan, and it killed the hype for JoJo. So when they did it again for Spy Family, people viewed it as a bad decision. Granted, now this happens so often that people actually like it, but at the time, it was a big part of the conversation surrounding the anime. These kinds of criticisms would only continue when season 2 dropped a year later. Generally speaking, the second season had all the same charm as the first, but there were a couple of reasons why anime fans started to lose interest. People were expecting the story to progress, but not considering the cruise fight that takes about 3 episodes. It's a lot of slice of life stuff, which raises an important question about the manga pacing as well, but we'll get to that in just a minute. The other issue was the animation. A lot of reviews say the animation saw a noticeable decline from season 1. As a matter of fact, I remember some people at the time claiming you would be very aware of which episodes were animated by which studio. Granted, they were working on both seasons together, but you never want to be that aware of that kind of thing when you're watching a show. That kind of inconsistency just adds to this idea that season 2 just felt like a big mess, even though it really didn't change that much from season 1. Again, part of that is due to the pacing of the show and splitting it into parts, but a large part of that comes from the manga. When it comes to the manga, Spy Family has 2 problems. One, which I already said before, is the fact that it releases every other week, which is fine if you don't follow the new chapters, but if you do, it means the story often feels slow unless you let it build up. And either way, it means the manga comes out with half as many chapters as a weekly series like One Piece or Dandadan. This is a big part of why people feel like nothing happens in the anime, because there just isn't that much to adapt. Even today, the manga only has about 13 volumes after 5 years. The other problem is that a lot of people sign up for the spy stuff and are disappointed to find out that this isn't the driving force of the story. Spy Family is in the weird boat of Shonen Jump series that are really comedy series but are marketed as action series, and really do have a lot of action and heavy plot narratives, but also is really just a comedy. Some series like Witch Watch balance this perfectly. Other series like Sakamoto Days go in the opposite direction and abandon the whole comedy thing very early. And then there's Spy Family, which is kind of in a unique spot. Spy Family is a lot of things. It's kind of a gag series, it's sort of an action series, but it's not the main appeal. Really, it's a matter of Spy Family largely being a character-driven story. Endo prioritizes the character arcs over the plot, which is great because Spy Family has great characters and they all get treated well, but it also means that the plot comes second to that. For example, the cruise fight I mentioned from season 2 doesn't happen till about chapter 43. In other words, it takes 7 or 8 volumes for Spy Family to reach its first plot-driven arc, an actual arc with stakes. But even then, it really only impacts Yor, and it doesn't even impact the core narrative surrounding the war or the Desmonds. It isn't until volume 10 where we get the first serious arc that actually has some bearing on the war. This arc takes us back to Lloyd's childhood and shows us how the war started and caused him to become a spy. It's both character-driven and plot-driven, and serves as a real transition in the story as it starts to pick up its pacing. But again, it takes 10 volumes, and for the anime we won't see this until 3 whole seasons. 4 if you count season 1 part Part 2. So with the story being so slow, even if you love the slice of life stuff, there's a serious question of whether Spy Family is really worth the investment. It takes a long time for anything to happen in the anime, and while the manga is currently the number 5 manga on Manga Plus, it's a series that a lot of people backlog and just isn't as talked about as some of the newer stuff. But this is where I have to step in as someone who kind of dropped the series and explain why Spy Family is better than ever. For context, I read Spy Family before the anime, and I read every new chapter that dropped right till about volume 10. At that point, I felt like the story was kind of flat and stopped reading the new chapters. A few months later, I tried again, but I still felt like the story was missing something. So I stopped reading for about a year until now when I saw that season 3 was coming up. So I went all the way back to chapter 1 and binged the entire manga up until chapter 115. It wasn't until I did this that I finally realized what the real problem was. Namely that Spy Family needed to focus even more on its characters. It isn't that Spy Family doesn't have a plot. There's plenty of stuff that happens. It isn't that Spy Family needs more spy stuff. It isn't even the pacing. The problem is that Spy Family is a character-driven story, but really only focuses on the 3 main characters for the first half of the story. It was the first 60 chapters where I felt lost. It's the reason why I didn't care that much about the Lloyd flashback. It was good, but it felt like more of the same. It wasn't until about chapter 80 or so when we get a flashback arc for Anya's teacher Henderson and Becky's maid Martha that I finally realized something. Spy Family has a ton of amazing characters besides Lloyd, Yor, and Anya. This Henderson arc is honestly my favorite in the whole series, and it has nothing to do with the main characters. It even expands on the backstory of the war, and it's full of romance. It's everything great about Spy Family without the main characters. We then take that same energy into the following arcs, where we meet the mother of Damien and find out more about the Desmond family. At the same time, we see some new sides to Yor and Lloyd that isn't just more of the same. In particular, I think Yor shines the most in these newer chapters, which is being used brilliantly in this current arc. So the problem all along was that we needed to use all of these great side characters. It's like in Tama, we don't have to ignore the main trio, but by fleshing out the dozens of side characters, we use all of the characters to their full potential, which is all the more important in a story that is mostly character driven. So to those of you wondering whether the manga is actually worth catching up to, I cannot recommend it enough. Spy Family feels like a completely different story after the Lloyd flashback, and it's truly the best it's ever been. And to everyone else wondering if Spy Family really deserves its spot as one of the highest rated anime, I think the success of the manga speaks for itself. The anime might not be a miracle of animation, but it's done by 2 of the best studios, and now that we're entering season 3, we're finally getting more of the character-driven moments. So overall, Spy Family is highly rated for a reason. It might not be as flashy as Kagurabachi or Sakamoto Days, but it's got plenty of action and the story does pick up later on. But more importantly, it's the kind of character-driven story with characters that are truly unforgettable. And this is how Spy Family delivers a story that always has a happy ending, even with some absurd bumps in the road. For all of those reasons and more, I really cannot recommend Spy Family enough.